the open chairs at the tables, if you would, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Steve Betts, and I'm with DuPont, and we're excited to have you all here today. And let me introduce quickly our partners from the EIU. The EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit, has created this index commissioned by DuPont as a tool to really help build a common language to provide metrics around food security, to really understand the drivers of food security, not just the rankings, but really what are the underlying factors. And so Leo Alberti is here today from the EIU. Raise your hand, Leo. Lucy Hurst and Martine Vieiro. And they're going to be, Leo's going to be doing the primary presentation and workshop, and Lucy and Martine are going to be working through the tables, making sure everything goes smoothly, answering questions, and really making this an interactive experience for you. So I'm not going to waste any more time because I think the real interest is going to be what Leo and Lucy and Martine have to say. But thank you again for joining. One housekeeping note is as you came in the door, you did receive a piece of paper that's just asking for your permission and okay that if you happen to get caught on a photo or a video, that's okay. So we ask for your signature and for your email address because I think we'd love to hear feedback about what you think about the Global Food Security Index, how you might use it, and so forth. So thank you for being here, and we look forward to a great interactive session.
Steve, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me well enough. As Steve said, my name is Leo Alberti. I'm the Global Forecasting Director for the Economist Intelligence Unit. If you're not familiar with the EIU, we're the business research arm of the Economist Group, and the Economist Group is the publisher of the Economist magazine. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Economist. The Economist has the magazine side of the house, and they have the business and economic research side, and I and my colleagues, Lucy and Martine, work on the economic and business research part of the organization. So let me explain to you what we'll be doing today, because it's unusual. We're calling this a workshop, and it is emphasis on work. You will be working here today, so if you're planning on sitting there and saying nothing and doing nothing, this is not the place to be. There will be some work this afternoon. This also should be, I think, quite a lively session. And I'll tell you why I'm saying that. As Steve mentioned, last year, DuPont came to us and asked if we could do some research in the field of global food security, but specifically to see if we could develop some kind of benchmarking tool for looking at where countries sit on that continuum of completely food secure, so maybe Norway or the United States compliant, or very food insecure country in sub-Saharan Africa, potentially Ethiopia. So we spent a good deal of time in 2011 and 12 designing and building this index, and we released it about a year ago, and we're actually now in the process of refreshing it, and we'll be releasing a new version of the index in just about a month. But what we tried to do here, as Steve mentioned, is instead of just looking, or in addition to just looking at where countries sit on this continuum of food security, we wanted to also look behind it and try to look at specific drivers, or what we would call determinants of food security. And why are we doing that? Because rather than simply saying, fine, we have a country in Western Europe at the top, and a country in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa at the bottom, that's not terribly useful unless you can understand where countries are performing, how they're performing individually, and therefore where they need to improve in order to move up the index, in order to essentially upgrade their food security position. The reason we're calling this a workshop is in order to get at those underlying factors, we took thousands of data points, 3 or 4 major categories of research, and a lot of individual indicators, and pulled them all together essentially into one data set. And that data set now sits inside of what you'll hear me refer to as a tool. And believe it or not, you'll see this. This tool has been loaded on the computers that you have on the table. So what we're going to be doing for the next hour, hour and a half or so, is giving you an opportunity to work through this tool, to use this, to be regions, into individual countries, to see where countries are doing well, to compare one country with one another, to even do some comparisons and even some correlations across these. It's not going to be overly technical, so don't worry about this. We don't need a statistics degree to do this. But it will allow you to just go beyond a simple ranking from 1 to 10 or 1 to 100 and actually look at what sits behind food security. Now, I'm going to give you much more in-depth, at least for about 10 or 15 minutes, understanding of what is in this index. But as a preview to what you'll be doing in a few minutes, I'm going to take you through the next hour, hour and a half. You have on your desks a few different things that you really should be aware of. One, you should have a packet here, 3 or 4 page packet that has a paper clip at the top of it. Each one of you, whether you're aware of it or not, is sitting in a region. You are representing one of the regions of the world. To tell which region you're representing, you just take that packet. You have an agenda on the front. Look past the agenda, look at the second page, and up at the top, in the left-hand corner, it'll say that you are part of either Latin America, or East Asia, or East Europe, Europe and Central Asia. So it tells you where you are. Right? You have that? You should have a sheet at the top that says workshop materials, and then after workshop materials, it'll have a region of Latin America and Caribbean. Yep, that's right. Does everyone see that? Right here at the top, if you look in front, right here in the upper left-hand corner. So you're all sitting in a particular region. In some cases, by the way, 2 of you are in the same region. In fact, in most cases, there are 2 tables per region. There's an exception or 2 to that. South Asia and North America just have 1 table. This is just because the way we can spread that across the region. So be aware of what region you're in, because once we start using this tool, you're going to be concentrating on the region you're in. You don't have to know a lot about the region. Don't worry. I mean, if you're a Europe specialist and you're sitting in Latin America, don't worry about it. It's even better that way if you're not too familiar with your region. So don't worry about being miscast. So that's number 1. The particular tool itself, what you will be using as part of this workshop, has been loaded onto your laptop. We're going to come to that in a few minutes. It's basically a very modified, nicely presented set of spreadsheets. Although these are very nice looking spreadsheets and don't look like any you've seen before, so they're very, very easy to use. So you'll be using this spreadsheet in order to get the answers to the questions that I'm going to be asking you. So part of this workshop will be me asking questions and you answering, hopefully providing the right answers. One other element to keep in mind. This being the social media age, we want to have an opportunity for everyone in the room to comment, even if we don't necessarily have the microphone in hand. So we will be having a discussion here. I will be probably calling on some of you. I'll be asking some of you to pose questions. But there are a lot of you in the room. Everyone's not going to be controlling the floor at any given time. And we want to make sure that if you have ideas, if you have thoughts, if you have answers to questions, and you don't have the microphone in front of you, you have a chance to be heard. It is, after all, democracy here. So you have also on your laptop a Twitter feed. You have a Twitter screen that's open. And my colleague Martine will be able to tell you exactly how that works. The purpose of the Twitter feed is, as I pose questions to you, as you hear what's being discussed in the room, if you have another answer, if you disagree, if somebody's hogging the microphone on the other side of the room, and you have some thoughts on it, we want you to just type your Twitter comment into the feed, and it's going to appear on the screen as well. So essentially, we want to have 2 levels of dialogue going on, whatever's happening in the room between those of us who have the floor at any given time, but also we want to have an opportunity for everyone. And again, you're going to have to share a computer. By the way, if you have your own device, it says here on the sheet what the hashtag is for Twitter. So it's GFSI for Global Food Security Index Workshop. So you can use that Twitter hashtag in order to comment yourself. So if you do have a handheld device with you of some sort, you've got a PDA, you want to use that instead of waiting for a turn on the laptop, please go ahead and use that as well. So we haven't done this before, but we think the idea is to get as many of you engaged throughout the session so that you won't feel that you have to wait for somebody to run a microphone over to you. All right? Any questions on that? I know it sounds a little bit complicated, but it'll get easier as we move along. All right, first thing I'm going to do is take about 10 minutes and give you just a quick presentation on what the Global Food Security Index is, because this index is the tool that you'll be using. And I'm going to take you through what we try to do, what is in it, and this way hopefully you'll get an idea for essentially what the principle and the theory we were trying to meet here. So let me go through exactly what we've done. Some of this I think will be fairly familiar to you. Why did we do this? Why did DuPont ask us to create this to begin with? We have today, in spite of substantial gains in food security over the last 30 years, there are still today 800 million people in the world who are still considered to be undernourished. So nearly 1 billion people out of a population of about 7 billion. So even though an enormous amount of progress has been made, especially since 1980, we still have a very serious situation. According to the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, about 2.5 million people each year are able to move out of a situation where they're undernourished. In other words, move out of food insecurity. So we are making progress. 2.5 million people are better off each year moving above that food security line. But even so, 800 million are still below it. And given the number of trends that we're seeing, it's possible, even likely, that that rate of progress will start to go down. Why is that? For a whole variety of reasons. Energy prices are very high. Energy prices are important in moving food around the world. We're actually seeing less research in some ways on food security, food development than we've seen before. Productivity, I'm sure many of you know there were huge gains in productivity a few decades ago, but the level of productivity improvements are not increasing at the rate we saw before, and a number of other factors. So the point is, even though we are making gains, the rate of improvement appears to be slowing down. So that means we have an issue that needs to be addressed. I think probably that's why many of you are working in this field. That's why all of you are here at this conference, because you appreciate the importance of food, agribusiness, food security, making sure people get fed. Now, one or two points to just emphasize how severe the problem can become at times. What you're looking at there is an index, another kind of index, of food prices. This looks at a whole variety of foods, beverages, crops, cereal crops, livestock, a lot of different things. And those big jumps that you see there in the middle are huge price spikes that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years, which were really devastating for people who were living in low-income countries that had high levels of food security. If you look at that second one where the arrow is, that was during the period in 2010 and 2011 when food prices spiked globally. Very, very high. Prices got so high that according to the World Bank, about 45 million people were pushed below the global poverty line just because of unexpected spikes in food prices. So just to give you an idea of the potential shock value of what will happen when prices go up, you can actually have, even after years of progress, 40 or 50 million people who in the space of a few months can be driven back below the global poverty line just because of spikes in prices. So I'm just trying to set the stage for why this is important and why we do have to make some progress. Now, what have we done through this research program to try to get at this? What we've tried to do is, as I mentioned earlier, to design, I'm going to call it an index, but you can also think of it as a benchmarking process, a way really of looking to see where countries sit. So we looked at a group of about 105 countries. We chose that number of countries because those were the ones for which we could find the best data. And we tried to look at those countries across 3 measures of food security. Affordability, so do you have the income where you can actually purchase the food? Availability or accessibility, so in other words, can you actually get the food if you can afford it? And then finally, the third measure of quality and safety. So is the food essentially good enough to eat? Is it good enough to have a sustained, healthy lifestyle? So when we talk about food security, that's how we're defining it. Affordability, availability, and quality and safety. So when we built this index, and when we looked at the drivers, we looked at the drivers as they fit into those three areas. Now, I'm going to just skip over for a moment, because I'm going to spend as much time on the workshop portion of this. We covered, as I mentioned, a little over 100 countries, about 105 countries. We wanted to make sure, though, that we were representing all the major parts of the world. So as you can see, we're listing the countries in each of the regions that we focus on. So a substantial number of countries in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East and North Africa, East Asia, South Asia, and so on. And again, all of you are now sitting, as it were, in one of these regions, and you'll be focusing on that particular region as we start moving into the workshop. Now, I mentioned that we were looking at the drivers, that is, those elements that contribute to food security or are holding countries back. I mentioned the three broad categories that we were looking at, and you can see those three categories there. So we looked at affordability, availability, and then quality and safety. I'll deal with the one, there's one in the lower right-hand corner that I'll deal with in just a moment. Within, the way you build a benchmarking index, the way we've chosen to do this, is within each of those three categories, we have to look at individual drivers. So look at this as sort of a pyramid. The very top of the pyramid is food security. Right below that, the wider part, are the major categories, and then the bottom of the base are the individual indicators. So the indicators build up into the category and overall into the definition of food security. So what kind of things are we looking at? You can probably see some of them there. So in the case of affordability, the key element we looked at is simply the incomes in the country. Most of you, I think, know what GDP is, gross domestic product. It's just a measure of income or wealth that the country generates. So I won't go through all of them individually, but you can see the kind of underlying factors that we were looking at. We would look at, for example, something like farmer financing within that area. So do the governments within the country make financing available for farmers so they can grow more crops? That's what we mean by affordability in some ways. We then also looked at availability. So in availability, we were looking at, say, agricultural production, how volatile or how steady it is. We're looking at measures like infrastructure. Are there roads that go from the fields in order to markets? We were looking at even something that seems a bit odd here, political stability. Because if you're in a country, imagine you were in some country, say in the Middle East right now, that are having unstable political regimes. We've looked in the past, I'm sure you would imagine, that if you have a country that's in civil war, that has an unstable political regime, what are the chances that food will get to market and you'll have a secure, stable food environment? Not very high. And then in the lower left, we look at quality and safety. So the assumption there is even if you can afford it, even if you can get access to it, what is the quality of the food? What is the protein content of the food? How good are the micronutrients that are within the food? Does the government, for example, have an agency, like say a Food and Drug Administration in the U.S. that looks after the quality? So we look at that as well. So those are all of the underlying building blocks that go into this. But one of the lower right-hand corner, which I won't stress too much now, is over the course of the year, we adjusted this index on the basis of global food prices. You remember I mentioned earlier that we've had a couple of big spikes in food prices over the last few years. So even though we only build this index once a year, we adjust it over the course of the year based on what's happening in global commodity markets. We're not going to do that now because that's a fairly complex process and we only have about an hour or an hour and a half to go through this. But if in the future, when you leave the room today, by the way, you'll have access to all of this information, including the tool. It's all freely available on the web. So if you choose to look at this later on in the weeks and months ahead, you can explore some of the pricing issues. But we're going to leave those aside right now and just focus on the underlying, what I would consider to be more the structural or fundamental aspects of food security. Now, this shows the results. And it shows that really using a traffic light pattern, green, amber, and then red, for how countries fare when we benchmark, essentially when we rank them or rated them for the first time when we produce the first edition of the index. So in some ways, there are not huge surprises here. Wherever you see green, that's essentially a country that finished in the top quadrant of the index. usually in the top third, the top 25% specifically. Those countries that are in yellow, so you can see Russia, China, Brazil, some other countries in Latin America, those that are in yellow are countries that generally finish in the middle portion of the index. And then those that are in red, which are predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, are countries that generally finish near the bottom, or at least the bottom portion of the index. Easy way to think about this, and you'll see it when you go on laptops. We have assigned scores to each of these countries. So in other words, there is a benchmark, there is a rating or scoring process. Very easy to understand. The closer you are to 100, the more food secure you are. The closer you are to 0, the less food secure you are. So a country that ranks 80 is obviously doing better than a country that ranks 70 or 60 or 50 and so on down the line. So that's just the way to orient this. We try to make it very simple arithmetic. Now, just a couple of findings from the first version of this index. And again, this is just to give you an idea of the sorts of information that came out of the index after we accumulated all this information, after we put it all into the model and determined where countries sit. So these were just a few key findings. First of all, by the way, the tables on the right-hand side there, I think should be fairly explanatory. We have essentially the top 10 countries, those that were the most food secure at the top, and then at the bottom, those that were least food secure. So again, you can see the numbers, the values on the side. The ones that did very well at the top were generally in the 80s, the ones at the bottom, for the most part, in the 20s. So there are a couple of overall trends that emerge from this. The countries that tend to do well, as I mentioned earlier, do tend to be countries that have fairly high incomes, which you would expect. But also these countries tend to spend more than average on public spending for research and development in agriculture. These are also countries, by the way, one thing that makes them more food secure. This may sound counterintuitive, but they actually spend less of their household income on food because they're wealthier. And because they spend less of their household income on food, it means if prices jump, they don't feel the effects quite as much. So, for example, there are some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 65% of all that these households spend during the month is on food. Whereas in the United States and some other richer countries, it may be as little as 10 or 12%. So the more of your household income you're spending on food, the more vulnerable you are. Because if prices go up, you're going to feel the impacts. So a few other just quick trends that I'll mention because I want to start the process pretty quickly. There were some interesting things we discovered. Some of the countries that finished near the bottom, or at least countries that finished in the bottom third, even though they're not doing particularly well now, these are countries that we project will have some of the fastest rates of economic growth over the next 10 years, which is a very promising sign. It means that some of the countries that are near the bottom of the index, or at least the bottom third of the index, are reforming their economies. The people in those countries, though by no means wealthy, will become wealthier over time. The countries will have more income. The governments will be able to spend more on food programs. People will be able to afford more food themselves as well. So one of the things we did discover is that a lot of those countries at the bottom, at least some of the countries, I should say, at the bottom, are going to be in a position where they should be able to improve their food security over time. One or two other things that I'll just mention briefly. By the way, these are the countries that we classify as low-income countries and those that tend to do the best. So these are all countries that the World Bank and others say are low income. By low income, we mean countries where people generally earn only about $1,000 a year. But even within those countries near the bottom, countries like Uganda, Kenya, and Myanmar and others did quite well within that group. So it's not always fair, is it, to compare countries perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa to northern Europe. So even if you look at countries within their own peer group, those are some of the countries that did particularly well and made good gains over the last few years. So you can see essentially what this process was intended to do. We chose indicators that measured elements of food security. We grouped them into categories, and then we brought it all together to try to determine where countries sit on this food security continuum. And then once we were able to do that, we looked at that data to see what trends emerged from it. The reason we did